A quiet pharmacy run turns into something darker when a black nurse is falsely accused, cuffed, and dragged out without cause. But when the officer duct tapes her mouth shut in the back of a squad car, thinking he can humiliate her into silence, he makes a mistake that will cost him everything. Because she's not just a nurse, she's connected to someone who knows exactly how to bring an entire corrupt system to its knees. What follows is a federal reckoning, the kind you rarely see coming, and once it starts, no one is safe from the truth. This is a story about power, justice, and the quiet strength that refuses to break. Let us know what time you're listening and where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. It was just past midnight when Denise Holloway stepped out of the clinic's back entrance, the automatic door closing behind her with a tired hiss, as if the building itself needed rest. The fluorescent lights inside flickered for a moment longer before going dim, leaving her bathed in the low amber wash of a broken street lamp. She stood there for a beat motionless, except for the slow rise and fall of her chest, her fingers still curled around the strap of her weathered leather nurse's bag, the one she'd carried for more than 2 decades. Her back ached in familiar ways, each vertebra whispering protests from 14 straight hours on her feet, and her legs, though steady, felt like they had long since turned to cement. She closed her eyes briefly and inhaled the thick southern air, warm, damp, and full of that faint metallic scent that always came after a long day in scrubbed linoleum rooms. The night was quiet, but not the peaceful kind. It was the kind that hummed just beneath the surface, holding stillness like a secret. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once, then fell silent. Crickets chirped sporadically like they too were struggling to stay awake. Denise opened her eyes again and began to walk toward her car, each step slow, deliberate, carrying the full weight of someone who had spent her life caring for others and was now simply trying to take care of herself. She unlocked her car with a soft beep, slid into the driver's seat, and sat there with the engine off, staring ahead through the windshield at the dark road beyond. There was nothing urgent to return to. No husband waiting at home he'd passed years ago. No children underfoot, her daughter was grown living states away. Just her cat, the hum of her old refrigerator, and the familiar silence of a house that once held more noise than she knew what to do with. She rubbed her temples gently and reached for her purse, pulling out the small white prescription slip her doctor had written earlier that week. "One stop," she murmured aloud, her voice hoarse from the long shift. "Just pick it up and go home." The drive to the all-night pharmacy took only 10 minutes, but she spent most of it in silence, one hand on the wheel and the other resting in her lap. Her eyes scanned the road more out of habit than concern, the kind of vigilance that nurses learned over time how to read rooms, people, situations. It didn't stop when the shift ended. It never had. When she pulled into the nearly empty parking lot, the store stood out like a pale box under harsh light, surrounded by shadows and empty storefronts. She parked under a flickering lamppost, its light pulsing unevenly above her windshield like a tired heartbeat. Inside the pharmacy, the air conditioning hit her like a slap, cold and overly sterile, smelling of vinyl and antiseptic. The place was quiet, save for the buzz of overhead lights and the occasional electronic beep from the checkout scanner. A teenage boy with tangled blonde hair sat slouched behind the counter, scrolling aimlessly through his phone. He looked up briefly when she entered, then back down again without a word. Denise approached slowly, her footsteps soft on the tile, and offered a small smile as she handed him her prescription, along with her ID and insurance card. "Evenin'," she said gently, her voice polite but firm. "Just here to pick up my refill." The boy glanced at the paper and started typing, his fingers moving in lazy, distracted rhythms over the keyboard. Denise waited, shifting her weight from one foot to the other, her body still recovering from the static motion of a nurse's day, always standing, never quite still. After a minute, she noticed the way his brow furrowed, his lips parting slightly as he squinted at the screen. He leaned toward the side counter and whispered something she couldn't hear. A moment later, a woman emerged from the back. White, maybe in her mid-40s, with tight lips and a clipboard pressed to her chest. Her eyes flicked over Denise quickly, then narrowed almost imperceptibly. The woman walked behind the register and tapped a few keys, speaking softly to the boy. Their tones weren't angry, but their posture had changed. Denise could feel it the way people did when the air inside a room shifts before a storm. "Ma'am," the woman said finally, her voice clipped and sugary sweet, "I'm sorry, but there seems to be an issue with your prescription tonight." Denise tilted her head, confusion passing quickly over her features before settling into calm. An issue. I've picked up this same medication here for years. The manager didn't blink. Well, the insurance information doesn't match what we have on file. That can't be right, Denise said, still steady. You have my ID, my insurance card. They match. The woman stepped back half an inch, her hand gripping the counter. I'm going to have to ask you to wait here while we clarify things. Denise's shoulders stiffened. She said nothing, but her eyes locked with the woman's. There it was again, the shift, the quiet sorting that happened before anything was spoken. The moment when skin spoke louder than facts. The boy at the counter wouldn't meet her gaze. He shrank behind his phone like it could shield him from complicity. She felt it deep in her chest, like a bruise blooming slowly. That old knowing, the one every black woman in America learns, not from books but from living. Something was coming. Something she hadn't asked for. Something she wasn't going to back down from. The store smelled like ammonia and air freshener, the kind that tried too hard to cover up something else, something musty and forgotten. Denise stepped lightly across the polished tile, her soles making soft, scuffing sounds as she moved past the shampoo aisle and up toward the counter. The lights overhead buzzed faintly, and the automated announcements on the PA system played too quietly to understand, just a murmur of syllables lost in the hum of electricity. Behind the register, the same boy from before stood hunched, still tapping at his phone, the glow of the screen painting his face in pale blue light. He looked up when he noticed her standing there again, his expression blank for a moment before it shifted into something vaguely alert, vaguely cautious, like someone who'd been trained to smile but forgot how. I'm just following up, Denise said, calm and soft, not apologizing, just waiting. I think there's some confusion with my file. The boy gave a small nod and turned back to the screen, typing with fingers that moved too fast to be careful. She watched him out of the corner of her eye, not suspicious, not angry, just aware. He hesitated after a few moments, frowned, and then clicked something with his mouse before leaning toward a small earpiece tucked beneath his collar. There was a quiet exchange she couldn't hear, but the effect came quickly. Footsteps behind the pharmacy counter, a rustle of papers, and then the manager appeared again like an actress stepping onto a stage she didn't want to share. Cynthia Mallory moved with a confidence that came not from kindness or competence, but from authority long left unchallenged. Her shoes tapped sharply on the tile as she approached, clipboard pressed tight to her chest like it held a truth no one else deserved to see. Her eyes scanned Denise again, this time slower, as though she were trying to catalog something. Race, posture, bag, tone of voice. Denise saw it all in the woman's gaze. She'd been seen this way before, evaluated, not acknowledged. Ma'am, the manager began, her voice tight at the edges of politeness. We're still showing a mismatch with the insurance information on this account. It looks like there might have been some kind of clerical error, or… Denise lifted her chin slightly, her voice unwavering. There's no error. That prescription's in my name. I've been filling it here every month for years. Cynthia smiled thinly, the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes, and didn't ask for resolution. I understand, but we have to follow protocol. And when the information doesn't match well, you understand how it is. There was something about that last sentence, how it hung there, unchallenged, like a shield and a threat. Denise's heart didn't race, not yet, but something in her stomach pulled tight. Not fear, not quite, more like the tightening of armor before a storm. Can I see what's on your screen? She asked simply. If there's a problem, I can help clear it up. The manager shook her head too quickly. Unfortunately, due to privacy policies, we can't show customer data directly. That's just how it works. Denise folded her arms, but she didn't raise her voice. That's convenient. The cashier shifted behind the counter, clearly uncomfortable, suddenly interested in some task that didn't exist. The space around them had changed less, a store now more a spotlighted stage. Denise could feel it, the subtle hush in the air, the invisible hand that sometimes presses against your spine when the world decides it doesn't believe you. Cynthia straightened. We've contacted someone to come verify the issue. I've asked the local police to assist. They'll help determine if this was intentional, just to be safe. There was no anger in Denise's face, only stillness. She blinked once, slow and deliberate, as if letting the weight of the moment settle properly into place before answering. You called the police for a prescription refill. It's just standard procedure, Cynthia replied, looking past her, already moving away. We have to report inconsistencies. No, Denise said, quieter now, but the sound somehow filled the space. You don't have to. You chose to. No one answered her. The boy kept his head down. Cynthia walked back to the pharmacy bay, leaving Denise standing at the counter with nothing but silence and the soft beeping of the register between them. She could have left. Could have asked for her papers and walked out. But walking out now would have made it worse, would have looked like guilt, like surrender. And she had done nothing wrong. Outside, a breeze picked up, rattling the glass doors with a low sigh. Inside, the fluorescent lights kept buzzing. Denise remained exactly where she stood, her eyes steady, her feet firm on the wax tile. This wasn't new, not the feeling, not the weight, but tonight it would not go unanswered. Not again. The chime above the pharmacy door rang sharply, too loud for the quietness of the hour, and Denise turned her head just in time to see two officers step inside their presence, slicing through the artificial calm like a sudden drop in pressure before a storm. The taller one moved first, broad-shouldered and thick-necked, with a buzz cut that looked like it had been trimmed that same afternoon, and a mouth permanently tilted in a sneer like he'd been born suspicious of everything he didn't recognize. His partner trailed just a step behind, younger, thinner, unsure. His eyes flicked around the store like he didn't quite know where to land them, and when they briefly met Denise's, he looked away too quickly for it to be anything but shame. The manager was already in motion, rushing to greet them with a manufactured urgency, her voice dropping into that syrupy, false, humble tone people used when they wanted to sound helpful but also in control. "That's her," she said, nodding toward Denise like she were pointing out a defective product. "She tried to pick up a prescription fraudulently. The insurance doesn't match. I think she might be using someone else's information." Neither officer looked at the computer. Neither asked for paperwork. Neither questioned the story. The tall one, Radford, his badge would later read, turned his body slightly toward Denise, squared his shoulders like he was preparing for resistance, and took a slow step forward. His hand hovered close to his belt, not yet touching the holster but close enough to make the message clear. "Ma'am," he said, drawing out the word just enough to make it sound like a warning, "I'm going to need you to come outside with us." Denise didn't move. She kept her hands visible and calm, the edges of her paper prescription still pinched between her fingers, and when she spoke, her voice was low and steady, shaped by years of bedside delivery and crisis management. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said. "This prescription is mine. You can verify it. I have my ID, my insurance." Radford interrupted her with a shallow breath and a tired shake of his head, as if she were wasting everyone's time with details. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way," he said, and it wasn't a suggestion. The second officer, Jensen, she would later learn, shifted on his feet, glanced at the pharmacy counter, then back at Denise, but still said nothing. From the far side of the store, a mother clutched her daughter's hand and guided her quickly toward the exit, eyes wide and confused. A man standing near the cold medicine aisle pulled out his phone and began recording the faint glow of the screen, catching the pale underside of his chin. Denise noticed barely in the corner of her vision, and something in her chest tightened. Not fear, not quite, but something heavier and older, like the aching throb of a scar pressed too hard. She raised the prescription in her hand and held it toward Radford calmly. "I'd like you to look at this," she said, not pleading, not defensive, just offering the truth in the only language she had. He didn't take it. He didn't even glance down. "I said step outside," he repeated, and when she didn't move right away, he reached forward and grabbed her wrist. The force was unnecessary. It wasn't a grip, it was a claim. The kind of grip used not to lead but to remind someone they weren't in charge of their own body anymore. Denise didn't resist. She didn't flinch, but her pulse jumped in her neck, and the sound of her own heartbeat throbbed in her ears like the slow ticking of a countdown. Gasps rose from behind her. One person whispered, "Is she serious?" Another said, "Wait, what's happening?" The questions were quiet, scattered, uncertain, but no one stepped forward, no one interrupted. That was the part that hurt more than the grip. As Radford twisted her arm behind her back and clipped on the first cuff, Denise kept her eyes forward, refusing to look at the manager, though she felt the weight of the woman's satisfaction blooming like heat against the side of her face. The second cuff locked in place with a sharp metallic snap, and Denise forced herself to breathe through the tightness crawling up her spine. She had worked 37 years in healthcare, had comforted mothers, sobbing over stillborn children, had held hands through death and pain and miracles, and yet, here in a fluorescent-lit pharmacy she had visited for a decade, was being marched out like a criminal for trying to refill a bottle of pills. Radford guided her toward the door with one hand on her shoulder, firm but not rough like she was fragile enough to break, but threatening enough to justify restraint. She heard the beeping of the automatic doors, the rush of warm night air brushing against her face, and somewhere in the back of her throat, a hollow disbelief stirred like a dry cough. "You're making a mistake," she said softly now, the words floating behind her like steam from a cracked kettle. Radford didn't answer. Jensen trailed a few steps behind, still silent, still staring at his boots like they might give him an excuse to look away from the mirror of his own inaction. They reached the squad car. Denise felt the weight of every gaze pressed against her spine like fingers she couldn't swat away. The metal of the car door was cool beneath her fingertips as Radford guided her in the cuffs biting into the thin skin of her wrists. She didn't ask for mercy. She didn't ask for anything. As the door slammed shut behind her, the whole scene compressed into a single image, the blinking fluorescent sign of the pharmacy, the low drone of crickets in the grass beyond the parking lot, and a black woman in navy blue scrubs sitting silently in the back of a police cruiser, her name and dignity wrapped in a bottle of pills no one had bothered to verify. And though her mouth didn't move, though her lips were still her eyes, said it for her. "You don't know who I am, but you will." The ride began in silence, the kind that doesn't offer peace but holds its breath like something's about to snap. Denise sat stiffly in the back seat, her hands cuffed behind her, the cold metal biting at the thin skin above her wrists with every slight movement of the vehicle. The plastic divider between her and the front seats reflected her face, faintly tired, composed, and eerily still, as if even the glass knew better than to interrupt the storm she was holding inside. Outside the window, streetlights passed in a slow, rhythmic blur, casting shadows across her cheeks like waves rolling over stone. Her jaw clenched tight enough to ache not from fear, but from the effort it took to keep from speaking, the first words that bubbled up, words sharpened by exhaustion and a lifetime of being questioned for simply existing. Up front, the two officers spoke in low, casual tones, as if the woman they had arrested was luggage rather than a person, a problem to be sorted before shift, change, and coffee. The older one, Radford, laughed under his breath and muttered something about these people always thinking they can get away with anything. Jensen gave a faint, non-committal grunt, not quite agreeing, not quite disagreeing, just floating in that gray space where complicity and cowardice blur into one. Denise heard every word. Not because she wanted to, but because she had learned over time to hear what wasn't meant for her, those moments when people stopped pretending and showed who they really were. She turned her head slightly, watching their silhouettes, and she felt it again, the thrum of disbelief pulsing through her chest, the fire low and hot and steady, not rage exactly, but the aching clarity of someone who had given too much of herself to a world that still met her with suspicion. They hit a red light, and Radford adjusted his rearview mirror until their eyes met. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. "You could have made this easier," he said, voice half bored, half blaming. "All you had to do was comply." Denise held his gaze and said nothing, letting the silence stretch out like a blade between them. He snorted and looked away. At the next corner they turned down a darker street, the kind lined with chain-link fences and abandoned storefronts, where even the streetlights buzzed with weariness. Radford pulled into the side lot of a closed-down fire station, gravel crunching beneath the tires, as the car rolled to a stop beneath a broken security light. The place wasn't on the way to the precinct, she knew that much. She'd worked in this part of town. She had stitched up kids who lived 3 blocks from here. "Why are we stopping?" she asked, her voice level but low, testing the air like a diver breaking the surface. Radford didn't answer immediately. He stepped out of the car, slammed his door, and walked around to the back seat with slow, deliberate steps. Jensen remained where he was, his hands clenched in his lap, eyes fixed on the dashboard like it might offer him absolution. The back door opened with a click that sounded louder than it should have, and Radford leaned in close, his breath thick with stale coffee and something sourer beneath. "You've been running your mouth," he said, almost amused. "I don't know who you think you are, but you're not in charge here." Denise didn't move, didn't blink. "I stated my name. I stated the truth. That's the problem," he said, reaching behind his belt and pulling something from the back pocket of his jacket. It was a roll of duct tape. In that moment, time didn't slow, it sharpened. The night air felt colder against her skin, her breath caught somewhere deep in her chest, and her pulse pounded behind her eyes like it wanted to see what was coming before it arrived. She had seen many kinds of cruelty in her life. Cruelty masked as protocol, as concern, as God's will. But this was something else entirely. This was about silence, about control, about making sure that the next time she opened her mouth she would remember what it felt like to be forcibly erased. Radford tore off a strip of tape with a harsh rip and leaned closer, his face a twisted mix of smugness and irritation. "You want to talk civil rights," he muttered. "Talk after this." He slapped the tape over her mouth with one quick motion, pressing it down hard enough to seal flesh to glue. She made no sound. Not a whimper, not a protest, but her eyes never left his. She held that stare with the weight of 1,000 unspoken stories of elders who had marched mothers, who had bled patients, who had died with no one listening. She looked at him like a surgeon assessing a wound, calculating, precise, and entirely without fear. And Radford, for the briefest second, faltered. Just a flicker, but it was enough to remind her that men like him only seemed powerful when others stayed quiet. He stepped back and slammed the door. Inside the cruiser, Denise sat with the tape across her mouth, breathing through her nose in slow, steady pulls. The adhesive tugged at her skin with every inhale, but she didn't shift. She just closed her eyes for a moment, long enough to feel her own heartbeat center itself again. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to shut her up, but this time there would be consequences. Back in the front seat, Radford put the car in drive, his expression unreadable, and Jensen still didn't speak. He stared straight ahead, as if the road could swallow the guilt if he just kept driving fast enough. And in the back, Denise didn't pray for help. She didn't cry. She planned. Because if they had hoped to break something in her with that strip of tape, they had badly miscalculated what kind of woman they had chosen to silence. The precinct came into view like a wound in the night, small, blocky, and humming, with the kind of fluorescent light that made every surface look jaundiced. Denise felt the car slow as Radford eased it into the cracked lot behind the building, gravel crunching beneath the tires with a sound that reminded her of brittle bones under pressure. The duct tape still clung to her mouth, pulling painfully at the corners of her lips, her skin now raw where sweat had begun to loosen the edges. No one had said a word since they'd left the alley behind the old fire station, and in that silence she had memorized the feel of those cuffs, the rasp of the tape, the casual cruelty behind every action taken against her. Radford yanked the door open and barked. "Let's go," in a tone so mechanical it sounded like he'd said it 1,000 times to people he didn't see as people at all. Denise swung her legs out slowly, carefully balancing herself as her shoes hit the ground. She rose without assistance, her back straight despite the sharp ache in her shoulders, and turned to face the building that was now more cage than institution. Inside, the air smelled of old coffee, disinfectant, and something metallic, maybe blood, maybe rust, maybe the stale echo of fear. The booking room was dim, cast in the harsh buzz of overhead lights that flickered slightly, as if unsure whether this moment deserved full illumination. A desk sergeant sat behind a counter cluttered with manila folders, plastic coffee cups, and a forgotten half-eaten sandwich wrapped in wax paper. He looked up briefly, blinked, and returned to whatever form he'd been half filling out. Jensen hovered behind her, now finally moving closer, clearly unsure whether to help or stay out of the way. It was the indecisiveness of a man trained to follow, but not to question. As Radford guided her toward the counter, Denise could feel eyes tracking her from other corners of the room, officers pausing mid-conversation, a woman in uniform leaning back from the vending machine, a couple of younger patrolmen glancing at each other with that familiar flicker of discomfort that blooms in the presence of injustice you're not ready to name. Radford tore the tape from her face with one sudden motion, and the skin beneath screamed, but Denise didn't. She inhaled sharply, coughed once, then swallowed the burn in her throat. He tossed the crumpled strip into a nearby trash can like it was a used napkin. The sergeant at the desk raised an eyebrow but still said nothing. "What's she in for?" he asked, eventually already pulling a fingerprint card from the stack beside him. "Attempted prescription fraud," Radford replied with a smirk, his voice deliberately louder than necessary. "Caught red-handed at the pharmacy. We might throw in resisting too." Denise didn't flinch. She looked directly at the sergeant's eyes, steady mouth, closed breath even. There was no shame to carry. That belonged to the ones writing lies and calling it law. The fingerprint process was rough. The sergeant grabbed her wrists, already sore and bruised from the cuffs, and rolled each finger over the ink pad like he was turning bolts. She watched the black smears appear on paper, each one a silent accusation, each print a quiet branding. Her wrists trembled slightly, but not from fear, from restraint, from the force it took not to pull away. "Name?" he asked without looking up. "Denise Holloway," she replied. He paused, just briefly. "Occupation, nurse." He looked up then just long enough for their eyes to meet, and something flickered there. Not recognition, not sympathy, but the brief disruption of a script. Then he looked back down and kept writing. When they were done, Radford motioned her toward the hallway. The corridor stretched out in dull linoleum and buzzing lights, every footstep amplified by the hollowness of the space. The holding cell was small, maybe 8 by 10, with a metal bench bolted to the wall, and a toilet in the corner, its lit-up bowl stained. They opened the door, pushed her in without words, and let it slam shut behind her with a clang that echoed all the way back to the front. She sat slowly, her joints stiff, her wrists throbbing where the cuffs had pressed bone against bone. The metal of the bench was cold and unwelcoming, but she made no sound, just folded her hands in her lap and looked ahead at the wall opposite her. There was no clock in the room, only the rhythmic buzz of the lights and the occasional distant voice shouting instructions or laughing at something no one else would understand. Footsteps came and went, keys jangled, a chair scraped somewhere down the corridor. But no one came for her, no one offered water or asked questions, or even acknowledged that she existed. And still she sat straight. From somewhere out of view, a voice floated in a younger officer asking, "What's she in for again?" Another answered, "Fraud, I think. One of those prescription things. Figures." That word stuck figures like a thorn in her ribs, as if her presence here was expected, inevitable, built into the architecture of the place. As if her body fit neatly into a narrative they'd been rehearsing their whole lives. She stared at the blank wall and let the silence settle around her. It didn't feel like defeat, it felt like gathering, like the quiet just before the first drops of a coming storm. Because no matter how many times they tried to strip it away, her dignity had survived worse nights than this. And she would not leave it behind here, not for a booking sheet, not for a lie, and certainly not for men who hadn't even asked her name before deciding who she was. The phone in the corner of the holding cell wasn't meant to offer comfort. It was bolted to the wall, grimy from years of fingers and breath, with a receiver that smelled faintly of sweat and plastic. Denise stared at it for a long moment before standing, her knees popping slightly as she rose from the cold metal bench. The overhead light buzzed again, flickering once, like it too was tired of pretending this place held any decency. She crossed the room slowly, her movements deliberate, each step measured, like it mattered because in this moment everything did. When she picked up the receiver, the dial tone came through thin and distant, like it was echoing across miles of wire that didn't really want to be connected. She paused with her fingers over the keypad, exhaled once, then dialed a number from memory, a number she hadn't used in years, not because she couldn't, but because she wouldn't. The phone rang only once before someone picked up on the other end. No hello, just the sound of breath and quiet, waiting. There was a beat of silence, not uncomfortable but heavy with history. Then Denise spoke, her voice stripped down to something so raw and true it didn't need explanation. "It happened again," she said, her words flat and unadorned. But worse this time. The voice that answered was calm and steady, a woman's voice, older but sharp like wind through oak leaves on a dry night. "Are you safe right now?" it asked. No judgment, no panic, just the voice of someone who had trained themselves to stay composed while the world tilted sideways. "For now," Denise said, her fingers tightening around the cord. "They taped my mouth shut, Miriam, like I was nothing." Another pause. Then, "Where are you?" "County precinct," she said. "Holding cell. They booked me for prescription fraud." Miriam's exhale was audible, slow, and contained like someone sealing a lid over boiling water. "Who's the arresting officer?" "Nameplate," said Radford. "White. Early 40s. The other one barely said a word. "Jensen, maybe?" "Got it," Miriam replied. Then more softly, almost like a promise, "I'm coming." Denise closed her eyes briefly, letting the words wash over her like a balm she didn't realize she'd needed. "You don't have to." "I do," Miriam said. "You know I do." For a moment Denise felt herself wanting to argue, wanting to fall back into the rhythm they had danced around for years. Distance, pride, silence. But this wasn't the time, and she was tired. Bone tired. Not just from the shift or the cell, but from the ache of being misjudged so many times that it no longer surprised her, only exhausted her. "Tell me what you want me to do," Miriam asked, her voice lower now, like it was being drawn closer to the heart of something sacred. Denise hesitated, then whispered, "Just make sure they don't bury this." Miriam didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was steel wrapped in silk. "They won't, not this time." The call ended without goodbye. No need for it. Between sisters like them, some things didn't require punctuation. Denise hung up the receiver and returned to the bench, her knees bending with more effort than before, but her posture still straight. She sat quietly, hands resting on her thighs, head slightly bowed, as if in prayer not for rescue but for clarity, because something had shifted in that call. A line had been drawn, and this time it wasn't in sand. It was carved in stone. She knew Miriam, knew how she worked, how she moved. Her older sister didn't raise her voice unless it mattered, didn't show up unless it was to finish what someone else had started. And when Miriam came, she wouldn't be alone. She would come with names, with papers, with calls to Washington if necessary. She would come not as backup, but as reckoning. Denise looked up at the humming fluorescent light above her, its glow washing everything in dull yellow, and whispered softly just to herself, "Let them keep underestimating me. Because the next knock at that door wouldn't be a question, it would be justice. And this time it would wear a familiar face." The shift in the air didn't come all at once. It moved like pressure before a storm, slow and certain, creeping under the walls and settling into the bones of the building. Denise felt it first, not through sound, but through the subtle changes in rhythm, footsteps growing quieter down the hallway, voices becoming sharper, but hushed the absence of Radford's loud swagger that had filled every space like smoke just an hour earlier. She lifted her head from the metal bench, her eyes drawn to the barred door, not with expectation but with awareness. Something was moving beyond it, something with weight. Down the hallway, a door slammed not violently but with force, the kind that wasn't careless but intentional, like punctuation at the end of a sentence that mattered. Another voice followed this one, deeper, older, calm, in a way that didn't ask for attention. It commanded it without trying. There was a pause, a shuffle of boots, and then the clatter of a clipboard hitting a desk harder than necessary. Denise closed her eyes for a breath, not to escape the noise but to let the silence behind it settle into her chest. She knew that sound. She knew that tone. She had grown up with it. When the voices rose again, they carried tension wrapped in civility. Radford's name echoed, once sharp and irritated, followed by another officer responding too quickly, like he was trying to undo something that had already gone too far. And then beneath it all, she heard her sister's voice, measured, clipped, and deliberate, each word like a scalpel peeling back the layers of a lie. "You will open that file," Miriam said from somewhere just out of view, "and you will show me the timestamp." Denise allowed herself the smallest smile, tight and fleeting, but it faded just as quickly. This wasn't over. Miriam being here didn't erase what had been done, but it meant that someone who could speak their language was now inside their walls, dismantling the machine piece by piece. She sat up straighter, rolled her shoulders gently to ease the cramp, and waited. A few minutes later, the lock on her cell door rattled once and then clicked. It opened not with a bang, but with a slow, deliberate push. The officer who appeared first wasn't Radford or Jensen, but someone new, someone younger with a nameplate she didn't bother to read, and eyes that refused to meet hers. Behind him stood two people in plain dark suits, each wearing a small DOJ badge clipped to their belt, and just behind them, framed in the doorway like a shadow long overdue, stood Miriam Holloway. Her sister had barely changed in 5 years, still tall, still composed, still dressed like every word she spoke would be recorded and reviewed. Her gray curls had grown a little fuller, pulled back tight at the nape of her neck, and her coat was the same navy wool she wore in courtrooms on the Hill, in every space that demanded respect before offering it. "Miriam," Denise said softly, her voice cracked but unshaken. "Hey, niece," Miriam replied, stepping forward, her voice low and warm but carrying a current underneath. "You good?" Denise gave a small nod, her eyes locking with her sister's, and in that look was a conversation no one else in the room would ever understand. Miriam stepped aside, allowing one of the agents to move toward the cell door with a key already in hand. "This is a federal matter now," the agent said, to no one in particular, his voice quiet but firm. "She's coming with us." The officer in the doorway hesitated, looked back over his shoulder, and received a nod from somewhere unseen. Without a word, he stepped aside. The agent opened the door, and for the first time since she'd been marched into this building, Denise stood of her own accord. She didn't rush. She didn't stumble. Every movement was deliberate, every breath measured. As she crossed the threshold of the cell, she felt eyes watching, officers pretending not to look the desk, sergeant peeking over his monitor, someone pretending to wipe down a hallway wall. They weren't ready to see her walk out. But she didn't look at them. She walked straight to Miriam. "You came fast," she said. "You called late," Miriam replied. They didn't hug. They didn't need to. The presence was enough. The two DOJ agents flanked them. As they walked down the hallway past the holding cells and break room and vending machine full of expired snacks. Every step was quiet but firm, the sound of leather soles on linoleum steady as a drumbeat. And as they reached the front of the station, where the low murmur of more voices now stirred behind the glass, Miriam turned slightly and whispered just loud enough for Denise to hear, "They have no idea what's coming." Denise didn't respond. She didn't need to. She just kept walking. Outside, the air felt different, cooler, sharper, like it had shed something heavy the moment the station doors closed behind them. Denise stepped into the night with slow, grounded movements, as if the concrete beneath her had shifted in density since she last touched it. Her wrists were still marked from the cuffs, her skin irritated where the tape had pulled at her face, but her posture remained intact. She didn't stumble. She didn't shrink. Instead, she breathed in deeply, the way a person does when they cross an invisible threshold and realize the war they just came through is no longer silent. Miriam walked beside her without speaking, her stride, calm and deliberate, not matching urgency but announcing it anyway. A black SUV idled at the curb, headlights off, two DOJ agents already waiting with tablets in hand, and expressions as blank as courtroom benches. They didn't speak to Denise, didn't ask her to explain anything. Their presence alone said, "We know," and maybe for now that was enough. In the back seat of the vehicle, Miriam pulled out a slim leather folder from her bag and began flipping through printed pages like a surgeon scanning charts before an operation. Denise sat next to her in silence, eyes watching the road, but thoughts retracing every detail of the pharmacy, the cuffs, the tape, the humiliation. None of it replayed with drama, just memory-like footage stored in the bone. "They have body cam footage," Miriam said, her tone brisk but low, like she was trying to make facts feel manageable. "They didn't disable it. It's already been pulled by our office." Denise didn't ask what it showed. She already knew. "They got you on video," Miriam continued, calm, clear, presenting your ID, asking questions. "And then they got him. Radford grabbing you without warning," and she stopped herself, her jaw locking briefly before continuing. "We're filing an emergency injunction with the federal circuit judge tonight." The driver didn't speak, but Denise noticed his knuckles tightening slightly on the wheel, a quiet flinch from someone used to carrying bad news in the rearview mirror. "They thought no one was watching," Miriam added, flipping another page, "but half the damn pharmacy was recording from their phones. You're already on 3 platforms." Denise turned toward her, then not angry, not panicked, just centered. "What are they saying?" Miriam paused. "They're calling you a nurse, a woman with dignity, a victim of abuse. Some are calling you a symbol." Denise looked back out the window, the edges of the city rolling past in quiet, tired patterns. "I'm not a symbol." "No, Miriam," said her voice softening, "but they need you to be one right now." That landed heavily, like truth, often does not sharp but full of weight that demanded carrying. Denise didn't answer right away. Instead, she watched a man in a reflective vest sweeping the sidewalk outside a gas station, his motions slow and practiced, like he'd been doing it for years, without anyone ever saying thank you. She wondered how many people passed him each night without looking, how many people saw and didn't see. Back at the temporary DOJ field office, a borrowed conference room inside a courthouse annex, the lights were brighter than necessary and the walls smelled like old paper and carpet glue. A projector hummed faintly in the corner, displaying footage already paused on a still image. Denise, mid-sentence, holding her ID, her expression calm and clear, her eyes locked on Radford's face. The room held half a dozen people, all in suits, all focused. Not one of them looked away when she walked in. A young black woman stood and offered her a bottle of water, her hands steady, but her eyes full of something that felt close to reverence. "Miss Holloway," she said quietly, "I just want you to know we've seen the footage. You handled yourself with so much grace." Denise took the water and offered a quiet nod. "I wasn't performing," she said. "I know," the woman replied. "That's why it matters." Miriam stepped to the head of the table and began briefing the team, laying out the timeline, the officers involved, the procedural failures, the civil rights violations already confirmed. Denise sat silently near the wall, listening, watching, absorbing it all, not because she needed to, but because she refused to be reduced to a headline built on half-truths. And as Miriam laid out the plan, press coordination, preliminary civil filings, direct complaint to the Department of Health and Human Services for patient mistreatment, Denise found herself not overwhelmed but sharpened. It wasn't vengeance in her heart. It was something older, slower, more enduring than rage. It was the insistence that she had never deserved what was done to her, and that the world for once was finally being forced to agree. When Miriam finished and the room settled into quiet again, one of the agents asked softly, "Do you want to speak publicly tomorrow? The media's already asking." Denise waited a moment, then responded, her voice low and even. "I'll speak, but not for their comfort, and not before I'm ready." There were nods, murmurs of understanding, the kind that didn't press or prod, just waited, because they all knew the same thing by now. This wasn't just about a false arrest. It was about who gets silenced and who chooses to speak anyway. The real unraveling began not with a dramatic press conference or a grand televised moment, but with a quiet click, someone opening a file they weren't supposed to access, and someone else pressing play on a piece of surveillance footage that had never been reviewed. It came in pieces like slow-falling ash after a fire, details landing one by one, light at first, but impossible to ignore. The Department of Justice's internal team had begun digging beyond just the incident with Denise, and what they uncovered didn't just confirm misconduct, it revealed a pattern long buried beneath procedure and polite paperwork that smelled of something rotten. It started with a tip, an anonymous email with timestamps and clipped security footage from inside the pharmacy, showing not just the moment Denise handed over her ID, but also the store manager whispering something pointed into the cashier's ear before picking up the store's landline. The camera caught her eyes cutting toward Denise, her lips tight, her expression set. She didn't look confused or concerned. She looked certain, calculated. And when she hung up the phone, she smiled to herself. Not warmly, but like someone who believed they had done the right thing, even if it meant someone else would suffer. That file led to another and then another. Within 48 hours, investigators found 5 previous complaints filed by other black customers at that same pharmacy, each one describing nearly identical treatment, being told their insurance didn't match, being asked to wait while the police were called, being accused of fraud before any verification. 3 of those complaints had been dismissed without follow-up. 2 of the customers had never returned and never answered calls from the legal team, but their names were now part of a timeline, a chain. The DOJ agents pulled the store's full surveillance log from that evening and synced it to police dispatch calls. The timestamps were clear. At 12:14 a.m., the manager, Cynthia Mallory, made the call to police. At 12:17, she whispered again to the cashier, whose name was now known, Jordan Fields. At 12:18, she looked directly at Denise and turned her back. And at 12:21, 2 officers entered the store. The manager pointed immediately without hesitation. "That's her," she had said. When confronted with the footage, Cynthia first denied it, then claimed she was just following policy. But there was no policy. Not written, not spoken, just a pattern. Jordan Fields was brought in for questioning. At first he tried to distance himself. Said he didn't remember the night clearly, said the store had been busy, said he had followed instructions. But under pressure and under the weight of undeniable video, he confessed. "She told me to stall," he said. "Told me not to process it, just wait for the cops to come. I didn't know it would go that far." Miriam watched the recordings in silence from her spot at the DOJ field office, her arms folded, her jaw locked. When the footage of the duct tape appeared on a synced bodycam feed, when Radford's hand reached back into the car and came out with that silver roll, no one in the room moved. The sound of the tape ripping across the screen was so visceral, so violating, it sucked the air out of the room. One agent muttered "Jesus Christ" under his breath. Another quietly left to make a call. But Miriam didn't blink. Instead, she turned toward the federal liaison officer beside her and said, "I want the pharmacy cited for racial targeting and malicious misconduct. I want Mallory's license flagged, and I want the company's parent brand looped in by 3 p.m. today." They did better than that. By morning, the company released a statement saying they had placed the manager on indefinite suspension pending an internal investigation. But Miriam didn't stop there. She filed a formal ethics complaint with the State Board of Pharmaceutical Operations. She handed off everything: statements, footage, testimony to the Civil Rights Task Force. And by that evening, Cynthia Mallory's name was trending online in 3 states, with headlines asking why a store manager was allowed to repeatedly report innocent black customers without consequence. Jordan Fields resigned the next day. In his statement, he said, "I didn't stop it, and that's on me. I'm sorry, Miss Holloway." Denise read the headline from her seat by the window, sunlight streaking through half-closed blinds. She didn't react. Not with relief, not with celebration, just silence. Miriam handed her a cup of coffee and asked, "You want to make a statement?" Denise took a sip, let the bitterness settle on her tongue, and said, "Not yet." The house around them was still. No reporters, no cameras, just quiet, just consequence. Outside, someone walked their dog down the block, and 2 kids rode past on bikes, laughing about something no adult would understand. Life was still happening, but now so was accountability. And in that strange space between damage and justice, Denise sat upright, the red marks on her wrists still visible but beginning to fade. What happened to her had been real, deliberate, and designed to break her dignity, but it hadn't worked. And now slowly, those responsible were beginning to realize what she had told them from the start. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The morning the reckoning came, the precinct didn't feel like a place of law. It felt like a waiting room for consequence. The air inside was different now, thicker somehow, like it was holding something back, unsure when it might break loose. Phones rang more often but were answered with shorter words, clipped syllables, nervous pauses. The officers who had once lounged against desks with coffee in hand and casual arrogance in their posture now stood straighter, spoke quieter, and avoided each other's eyes. They had all felt the shift, not as a moment but as a series of things they could no longer ignore. At 9:03 a.m., 2 federal vehicles pulled up without sirens, no lights, just quiet certainty. 4 agents stepped out, suits, sharp expressions, unreadable, each one moving with the kind of practiced precision that only comes from walking into buildings that didn't expect them, but now had no choice. The front desk officer who had laughed at the intake form just 2 nights before stood up too fast and knocked over his coffee. He didn't bother cleaning it up, he just stared at the approaching figures like they might ask about the stain. Miriam walked in last. She wasn't wearing anger. She was wearing clarity. A navy blue blazer, crisp white shirt, her DOJ badge clipped to the lapel like punctuation. Her face calm but serious, her steps slow but absolute. And she didn't speak to anyone on her way in, not yet. In the back of the station, Radford sat in the break room alone, nursing a bruised ego and a silent cell phone. His partner Jensen stood near the water cooler, arms folded, eyes darting like a man trapped between guilt and fear, unsure which direction to fall. When the agents called their names, neither answered at first, not because they didn't hear, but because they knew exactly what was coming. Officers Rick Radford and Kyle Jensen, one of the agents, said, voice steady, "You are hereby placed on administrative suspension, pending investigation into civil rights violations, unlawful arrest, and excessive use of force under federal statute." Radford stood, mouth already opening to argue, but Miriam's voice cut in clean and sharp. Not a word. She stepped forward, her gaze locking on his with surgical precision. Not anger, not emotion, just truth. You taped a woman's mouth shut. You cuffed her without charge. You paraded her through public space like a trophy of your control. That is not policing. That is a violation of everything this badge pretends to stand for. Radford sneered, but the edges of it were already unraveling. "You don't scare me," he said, but even he seemed to hear how unconvincing it sounded in the quiet that followed. "I'm not here to scare you," Miriam replied. "I'm here to end your career." Behind her, the agents moved in calm and precise, requesting badges and service weapons. Radford hesitated for a second longer, then yanked his badge from his chest and dropped it onto the table with a metallic clatter. The sound echoed through the room like a small collapse. Jensen followed slower, his hands trembling as he unclipped his own badge and surrendered his firearm, avoiding everyone's eyes. But Denise's, who now stood at the hallway entrance with her arms crossed, watching everything unfold. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough to expose every lie they had told. As they were escorted from the room, cameras outside had already begun flashing. A few reporters shouted questions that no one answered. And though neither Radford nor Jensen was in handcuffs, the posture of the federal agents flanking them said clearly that this wasn't freedom, it was containment before judgment. Back inside, Denise stood quietly by a window, watching the parking lot fill with more black cars, more agents, more people with folders in hand and purpose in their steps. One of the precinct's senior officers approached Miriam, hesitantly, voice barely above a whisper. "What happens now?" Miriam looked at him, expression unreadable. "Now you cooperate fully. You turn over all body cam footage, internal memos, and dispatch logs from the last 7 days. No redactions, no stalling. And if I find out anything's missing, I will be back, with warrants and teeth." He nodded, swallowing hard. Denise turned slightly, her voice level. "Tell your officers this isn't revenge." He blinked at her. "Then what is it?" "It's repair," she said. "And you're either part of it or part of what gets removed." A silence followed that wasn't hostile, but wasn't warm either. It was the kind of silence that settled when the truth finally filled a space where denial used to live. By noon, news outlets across the region had picked up the story. Denise's name was everywhere, alongside the words "nurse arrested, silenced justice." Footage from the pharmacy, the dashcam feed, the still shot of her standing calmly in the cell. It all traveled faster than anyone expected. What had begun as a quiet night with a single phone call now bloomed into something undeniable. In a press briefing outside the DOJ field office later that afternoon, Miriam stood at a podium and addressed the gathered media. "This was not an accident," she began. "This was not a miscommunication or a misunderstanding. This was a failure of power, judgment, and restraint. And the only reason we are standing here today is because one woman chose not to stay quiet." She looked toward Denise, who stood just off to the side, her hands folded gently in front of her face, calm but unreadable. "I didn't come forward to inspire anyone," Denise said later in a quieter room when asked by a young journalist what she hoped would come of all this. "I came forward because they tried to erase me, and I won't be erased." The tape had left marks on her skin. The cuffs had left bruises. But the silence they had tried to force into her mouth, that was gone now. And in its place was something steady, something enduring. Not noise, but voice. The auditorium wasn't grand, just a repurposed community center gym, with folding chairs lined in imperfect rows, a podium borrowed from City Hall, and a humming old air conditioning unit that clicked every few minutes like it had a nervous tick. Still, every seat was filled. People leaned against the back wall, stood in the aisles, and crowded by the doors, their faces a mix of curiosity, anger, and something quieter, something closer to hope. The overhead lights buzzed, casting a yellow sheen across the polished floor, and the room smelled faintly of old paint, coffee, and nerves. Denise sat off to the side, waiting for her name to be called, her hands folded in her lap, her posture straight, her breath measured. She could feel the eyes, hundreds of them, some familiar, some strangers, some searching her face for reassurance, others just needing proof that what had happened to her could happen to anyone. The mayor stood at the podium, first delivering his remarks with too much paper and not enough conviction. He used words like reform and oversight, his tone heavy with practiced regret. Denise listened not for the performance but for the spaces between words, the ones that revealed what he still didn't understand. The interim police chief followed next, a woman with tired eyes and a voice that cracked only once when she said the word accountability. She spoke of policy reviews, of immediate changes to use of force training, of partnerships with civilian-led review boards. She looked directly at Denise when she said, "This department owes you more than words." And Denise nodded politely but said nothing. Words weren't the currency she traded in anymore. Finally, they called her name. She stood slowly, every muscle feeling the memory of the cell, the tape, the cold bench where she'd waited in silence. Her walk to the podium wasn't theatrical, but it held weight. People leaned forward as she approached the room, drawing in a collective breath. She didn't carry notes. She didn't need them. Her voice, when it came, was even, clear, strong without being loud. "I didn't come here tonight to forgive," she began, eyes scanning the crowd slowly. "And I didn't come to be applauded." She paused, letting that settle not as drama, but as truth. "I came because people keep asking what I want, what justice looks like, what I hope will come from all of this. And the truth is, what I want is what most of you want. To be seen, to be safe, To not have to explain myself every time someone in a uniform decides my life needs interpreting. There was no sound in the room but the steady hum of the old air unit and the creak of someone shifting in their chair. I didn't resist. I didn't lie. I didn't fight. And still, she stopped herself, her throat catching just slightly before continuing. Still, they tried to shut me up, tried to turn my body into a warning, tried to make me small enough to forget. She looked down for the briefest second, then raised her eyes again. But I'm not small. And neither are you. A murmur passed through the room, soft but electric. I accept the apologies, she said plainly. I hear the promises. But I will not accept silence when the cameras are gone. I will not accept another woman being cuffed because her tone made someone uncomfortable. I will not accept a system that needs to be burned down every time someone has to prove they're human. Someone at the back wiped their eyes. A young man near the front nodded slowly, hands clasped in front of him as if holding something sacred. I am not special, she continued. I just had someone who picked up the phone when I called. That's the only difference between me and hundreds of others who've been forgotten in the same rooms I was dragged through. The lights above flickered slightly, and the podium creaked under her hands as she leaned forward, voice lowering. So, if you want to honor me, don't do it with flowers. Do it by showing up for the next person who can't speak. Do it by staying loud when the story fades. Do it by remembering that dignity isn't a favor. It's a right. She stepped back, then slowly, deliberately, and as she turned from the podium, the room rose with her, not in a burst of clapping, but in a kind of collective stillness, a standing acknowledgement that something inside them had been named out loud. That standing, breathing, surviving with dignity was in itself a declaration. Denise returned to her seat. Miriam reached over and touched her hand lightly, nothing dramatic, just presence. And outside, where the night had cooled and the press waited behind barriers, the streetlights flickered over people still arriving, still watching, still listening. Because something had shifted, and now that it had a voice, it wasn't going quiet again. The porch creaked softly beneath Denise's bare feet as she stepped out into the golden hush of early evening, the sun sagging low behind a line of distant oaks, casting long slanted shadows across the yard like quiet reminders that the day had earned its rest. A breeze moved gently through the trees, lifting the corners of the newspaper folded on the porch table, carrying with it the scent of cut grass and warm soil. The air felt lighter now, like something had been unknotted, released, allowed to stretch again, after too many days pulled tight. She held a cup of tea in both hands, letting the warmth soak into her palms as she eased herself into the rocking chair her father once sat in every night back when peace wasn't something you had to fight for. The cushion sagged in just the right places, and as she leaned back, the soft creak of wood felt more like a sigh than a sound. The house behind her was still. The phone didn't ring. No reporters waited in the driveway. No one asked for statements or speeches. Miriam stepped out a moment later, barefoot too, holding her own mug, her blazer long since shed sleeves rolled up. Her face was tired, but relaxed in a way Denise hadn't seen in years, like they were finally standing on the other side of a storm that had always been coming. "You sleep at all?" Miriam asked, settling into the chair beside her, eyes watching the sky. "A little," Denise said. "Didn't dream much, just quiet." Miriam nodded. "Sometimes that's all you need." They sat like that for a while, letting the silence hold them, not the kind filled with tension or things unsaid, but the kind that comes after truth has been spoken out loud, and the world is finally learning how to listen. In the distance, a dog barked once, then again. A child's laughter rang out faintly from down the street, carried on the breeze like music no one had to pay for. Denise sipped her tea, then set the cup on the railing, her fingers grazing the chipped paint as she looked out over the yard. "You think it'll stick?" she asked quietly. "The changes," Miriam thought for a moment, then replied. "Maybe not all of them, not right away, but something cracked this time. And cracks don't go away, they spread." Denise nodded slowly, the weight of those words settling somewhere deep, not heavy, but firm. She stood after a while, her joints aching gently from days spent, standing for something larger than herself, and walked barefoot across the porch, her steps soft in the grass. At the edge of the yard, she paused, looking back toward the house, the porch, the two chairs now resting side by side like markers of survival. "I'm not done," she said quietly. Not to Miriam, not to the world, but to herself. "But I'm home." And this time she meant it. What happened to Denise Holloway wasn't just about one woman one night or one terrible decision. It was about a system that too often punishes dignity, silences truth, and protects the people who abuse their power the most. But this time, it didn't end in silence. It ended with someone refusing to shrink, refusing to be erased. Denise reminded us all that dignity is not given by titles, badges, or institutions. It's carried within us even when the world tries to strip it away. Her story is a powerful lesson in how ordinary courage can ignite extraordinary change. It teaches us that being quiet does not mean being weak, that endurance is not the absence of pain, but the insistence on standing tall through it. It reminds us that justice isn't always loud. It can begin with one phone call, one truth, one voice that refuses to go unheard. And for those of us watching, especially those who've been told we're too old, too tired, too late to make a difference, let this be your reminder: you're never too late to speak, to rise, or to matter. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of your own worth or someone else's, we hope you'll take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Not just for more stories, but to keep these voices alive, to remind others that silence is never the end. It's just the pause before something powerful begins. Thank you for watching. Stay strong, stay kind, and stay awake.